Now, as I mentioned before, I'm talking about the wrath of God. And you'll understand that when we look at the Old Testament and we look for the theme of the wrath of God, I'm really spoilt for choice. There are many, many passages that I could have read this morning which reflect this idea of wrath and judgment. So I've chosen Ezekiel 6. It's a reasonably short chapter and I can read the full chapter to you this morning. So as I mentioned, I want to divide this morning up into 3 parts. And what I want to talk about most immediately is that wrath is not part of the true nature of God. Certainly sounds as though it is when you read that passage from Ezekiel and, as I say, many others in the Old Testament. But when we come to the New Testament, we find something quite different is expressed. And I wonder many of you are familiar with at least part of this from the first epistle of John. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. It's a very different picture from the one we obtain reading the Old Testament on its own. We learn from reading the New Testament an entirely different picture of who God is, what God is, how God operates. So I want to share with you some of the things that Jesus himself taught. Jesus said, "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand." These are the words of the Lord when he was accused of casting out demons by demons. You see? So he was a prince of darkness, therefore he was able to cast out dark demons. That was what he was accused of. But Jesus makes the point, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation. So if the devil is divided against himself by casting out demons, Jesus' point is that, well, no, I can only be doing this by the power of God. Now, if we turn it around and realize, we need to realize something else, that the Lord cannot be divided against himself either, or else his kingdom will not stand. And if God is love, God cannot do what is not loving. Do you see? There cannot be a division in love. In the same way as Jesus is saying, there cannot be a division in evil. And then we have other passages like this one from Matthew chapter 5. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount. "You have heard it said, 'You shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. And this is the point, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." It is a quite different picture of God than the wrathful one. God is unable to do what is unjust. God is unable to do what is evil. The Lord can only do and can only manifest what is loving. And I want to move on now to a passage from Swedenborg when he's talking about, this is part of Exodus and a conversation that's going on between the Lord and Moses. And it's an expression of the Lord's anger in this particular instance. And Swedenborg writes this, "The absence of any anger in Jehovah is evident from the consideration that he is love itself, goodness itself and mercy itself, while anger is the opposite and is also a failing, which is inapplicable to God. For this reason, when anger in the word is attributed to Jehovah or the Lord, the angels do not discern anger, but either mercy or the removal of the wicked from heaven. Now I'm going to go on. I haven't put it on the slide because there's a lot of words here, but I just want you to hear what is shared here. The word attributes anger to Jehovah or the Lord because of the very general truth that all things come from God, thus the bad as well as the good. But this very general truth, which young children, older ones and simple people need to have, must at a later stage be clarified. That is to say, it must be shown that bad things are assignable to man, though they seem to be assignable to God, and have been declared to be so to the end that people may learn to fear God, so as not to be destroyed by wicked things they themselves do, and may then come to love Him. Fear must come before love in order that love may have holy fear within it. For when fear is instilled into love, that fear is made holy by the holiness of love. Once it is made holy, it is not a fear that the Lord will be angry and punish them, but a fear that they may act contrary to goodness itself. For to do that will torment their conscience. Furthermore, it was by means of punishments that the Israelites and the Jews were compelled to fulfill the external and formal requirements of religious laws and commands. This led them to think that Jehovah was angry and punished them, when in fact they themselves, through their idolatrous behaviour, were the ones who brought such things upon themselves and cut themselves off from heaven. Their own behaviour brought about their punishments. As it also says in Isaiah, "Your iniquities cause division between you and your God, and your sins hide His face from you." And since the Israelites and the Jews were confined to the fulfilment of external requirements and knew nothing internal, they continued to believe that Jehovah was angry and punished them. For people who concern themselves only with things of an external nature, but not with anything internal, do everything out of fear and nothing out of love. So reading from John's Gospel this time. And this is, I think, probably one of the most uncharacteristic occurrences in the Bible. One of the most uncharacteristic things that Jesus did is to clear the temple. And I'm going to read from John's Gospel from verse 13 to 22. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us, since you do these things?" Jesus answered and said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews said, It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. So I want to think about the idea of wrath as an appearance of love. As I said, that story from the Gospel is, for me, one of the most uncharacteristic things that Jesus ever did. Now I want to talk about this word appearance. It's one that occurs in in Swedenborg's work many times. And it's very tempting for us to think that this word appearance means unreal. And whilst, yes, that is part of what it means, it's not necessarily the case. Swedenborg, for example, talks about, in the spiritual world, he talks about what he calls real appearances. About this word appearance in terms of a manifestation of something. Okay, so a manifestation of love. Does love ever look like anger? Well, I can tell you, if you've ever faced any of these, it does. Pam and I spent 6 or 7 years in Canberra riding to work, and morning riding around Lake Burley Griffin at times, we would come across an angry mother duck. There might be a mother duck and a group of ducklings who were just wandering across the cycle path. And watch out if you got too close to these ducklings on the cycle path, because the mother duck would come at you, at a cyclist, and wings spread out, beak open, and making a lot of noise, trying to scare you away from her children. So love sometimes looks like anger. We know that from experience. But of course, once you pass the nest of the magpie, once you pass the ducklings and you've not caused any harm, then the wrath of the mother subsides. She forgets you, and she goes protecting her young once more and looking for other threats. So we know that love can look like anger. But what happens when the mother perceives the threat as coming from within? Mums, dads, you've had the experience, I'm sure, of seeing the behaviour of your children as a threat to themselves. How do you react in that case? I can tell you a story about our son Alex when he was probably this high. Alex was a handful at times, and I remember on one occasion he decided, we were out, we were in a supermarket somewhere, can't remember where it was, but he decided he was going to run around with his eyes closed. And I said, "Alex, I don't think that's a good idea. You're going to hurt yourself." Well, he didn't listen. That was what he was going to do. And all I could do as a father was simply hold his hand to prevent him doing too much damage, either to himself or to other people, or to, we're in a supermarket, we're in the produce section. Imagine him running into one of those big boxes of, mangoes or tomatoes or something and spreading it everywhere. Anyway, that's what I did. I could only hold his hand and make sure he didn't do too much damage, and then be there ready for the inevitable, which was, in Alex's case, he ran into a pillar. He ran into a pillar. And of course, I can tell you he kept his eyes open after that. But you see, this is what we experience as parents. We look at our children and we see sometimes the danger is within, not outside us. So what is the goal of the Lord in looking over our lives and watching over our lives? It's this. It is of the divine providence that what has been severed should be made one, and thus that the marriage of good and truth should be restored. The Lord's goal is the preservation of what is good. But that requires at times a separation to take place. Good must be separated from evil. And it requires a judgment upon the evil. And that, on occasion, depending upon our point of view, appears as wrath. And that is why we see this uncharacteristic display of Jesus in the temple on that day. I wonder if that psalm was as you expected it to be. It wasn't what I expected. I expected something much grander and, kind of forthright and kind of preaching the gospel sort of stuff. That's what I was thinking Psalm 69 might be like. But it's not, it's a lament. And I notice in particular these words, "O God, you know my foolishness, and my sins are not hidden from you." Now it's interesting, we have those words, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." And the disciples attribute that to, it's the Lord, isn't it? It's the Lord's action in the temple. And yet, how can these words also be attributed to the Lord in the same way? How is this speaking about the life of Jesus? I have a colleague who I remember saying, he describes the Psalms as the spiritual diary of the Lord. How does this fit with that idea? Well, what it makes me think is that the clearing of the temple, John chapter 2, it's a metaphor for the Lord clearing out the evils of the heredity that he had received from his mother, the human heredity. The Lord was given that in order to be put in contact with hell so that he could then fight it. And so this idea of my sins are not hidden from you, this is the Lord's heredity with which he does battle. And in the temple courts we see him casting that out. Now of course there's a wider context to that too, that he casts out what is evil that is preventing us from accessing the Lord, that is preventing us from accessing heaven. So I want to move on to an idea of true order as we move towards reconciliation with love. From Heavenly Secrets once more. True order for a person, therefore, is to lead a life of good which comes from the Lord, that is, to live from the Lord. The influx is constant. It enters into every single impulse of a person's will and turns it as far as possible in the direction of true order. For the will that is properly a person's own is constantly drawing him away from such order. So we have these two natures within ourselves that does battle with one another. And the Lord is drawing us towards true order. He is drawing us towards love, the experience of love and the action of love. Now, as Swedenborg continues this passage, he talks about the voluntary and the involuntary movements of the body. And he talks about the way that the voluntary movements of the body, those movements that we have control over, are constantly leading us away from order, but the involuntary movements are leading us towards order. And it got me thinking about this idea of voluntary and involuntary movements. Imagine the havoc you could wreak on your body if you could control the beating of your heart? Imagine the impact that would have on you. How many of us would, well, we wouldn't live another night, would we? So he talks about this, the involuntary movements, what's controlled by the Lord in our body is leading us towards order, towards life. But what is voluntary, the things we have control over, tend to lead us away. So it's not the Lord who punishes and destroys, it's the evil who punish and destroy themselves. And the Lord is constantly trying to work against that because he's trying to draw us towards love. And I think I just want to share this one more passage with you. Again, the heavenly secrets. Those governed by goodness and truth never destroy those ruled by evil and falsity, but merely move them away. This they do because good, not evil, governs their actions. And good comes from the Lord who never destroys anyone. Those ruled by evil, however, and consequently by falsity, try to destroy. When they try to do so, they destroy themselves. That is, they hurl themselves into damnation and into hell. Such is the law of order. And I think we understand this idea. We have, I'm sure many of you have seen those very satisfying movie endings where you have the battle of the good guy and the bad guy, the hero and the villain. And the hero is never the one to absolutely defeat the villain. It's always the villain who does so. It's always the actions of the villain that revisit upon himself. I also mentioned on Friday night, again, I read a book several years ago, which was a kind of a what-if book. It was about military history, which is quite uncharacteristic for me. And it was saying, well, what if the other side had won these key battles or these key wars in the history of the world? So, for example, what if Hitler had won World War II? And it was an essay based on what would the world look like if Hitler had won World War II. But I remember the chapter about Waterloo the most. What if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo? Well, the chap who wrote that essay made the point that Napoleon was his own worst enemy. Napoleon was defeating more and more of Europe and making his empire bigger and bigger. And as a result, he was stretching his army thinner and thinner and thinner across the ground. And so the writer of this chapter said simply, if Waterloo had not gone, if it had gone in Napoleon's favour, Napoleon would have lost the next one, or possibly the one after that, because he would have continued to stretch his forces thinner and thinner. Sorry. I think I better stop talking soon. We are our own worst enemy. The villain is always the one who puts himself in jail or is his own undoing, not the Lord. And our challenge in life is to cooperate with the Lord. It's not about defeating the villains. The villains will defeat themselves. It is about living our best life. It is about living the life of love that the Lord calls us to. So I wonder how you see the Lord. How do you see him, as a whole, but moment to moment in your experience of life? Do you ever perceive the Lord as angry? And perhaps is that a sign that you need to make a subtle change in your attitude or your actions in the way that you live?